On a perfect spring morning in 1954, beloved teacher Eleanor Hayes led her class of 24 fourth graders into the Pennsylvania woods for their annual nature walk, their laughter echoing through the trees as they disappeared around the bend. When a landslide 60 years later exposed their underground shelter, investigators discovered the heartbreaking truth. The teacher who vanished with her students had been trying to save them from a nuclear war that never came. The morning of May 12th, 1954, arrived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania with the kind of perfect spring weather that made children restless and teachers smile. Miss Eleanor Hayes stood at her classroom window, watching the last patches of snow melt from the schoolyard as she sipped her coffee from a chipped blue mug. At 28, she had been teaching fourth grade at Millbrook Elementary for 3 years, and her students adored her gentle patience and infectious enthusiasm for learning. 24 children sat at their wooden desks, barely containing their excitement about the day's special adventure. Today was the annual nature walk along the old Seneca Trail, a tradition Miss Hayes had started to teach local history and botany away from stuffy textbooks. The trail wound through the Pennsylvania wilderness for miles, following paths once used by Native Americans and early settlers. Tommy Chen, the class president with thick-rimmed glasses and a serious demeanor, raised his hand eagerly. "Miss Hayes, will we really see where the Seneca warriors used to camp?" His parents had immigrated from China just 5 years earlier, and Tommy was fascinated by American history, especially the stories of the people who had lived on this land before European settlers arrived. "We certainly will, Tommy," Miss Hayes replied, her brown eyes sparkling with excitement. "And if we're very quiet, we might even spot some deer near Miller's Creek where they come to drink." Sarah Mitchell, a shy girl with auburn braids, clutched her notebook tightly. She rarely spoke in class, but loved to draw the flowers and animals they studied. Today she had brought colored pencils to sketch whatever they discovered. Her mother had packed extra sandwiches because Sarah always shared her lunch with classmates who forgot theirs. Billy Hartwell, the class troublemaker, was uncharacteristically quiet. The stocky boy with freckles and unruly red hair usually spent mornings in the principal's office, but today he sat perfectly still. Even Billy was excited about exploring the woods instead of sitting through arithmetic lessons. Miss Hayes checked her watch and smiled. "All right, children, let's gather our things. Remember to stay together and listen carefully. The forest is beautiful, but it's also very big, and we don't want anyone getting lost." The students lined up by the door, their lunch sacks rustling with anticipation. Miss Hayes had spent weeks preparing for this trip, studying maps of the trail and packing a comprehensive first aid kit. She had even contacted the local ranger station to confirm the weather would hold. Principal Robert Thornfield appeared in the doorway, his round face beaming. "Have a wonderful adventure, everyone. I expect you back by 3:30 sharp for dismissal." At 9:15 in the morning, Miss Eleanor Hayes led her class of 24 students out of Millbrook Elementary School and toward the trailhead at the edge of town. Parents waved from their windows as the cheerful group disappeared into the tree line, following the path that had been walked for hundreds of years. None of them knew they would never return. The first sign of trouble came at 3:30 sharp when Principal Robert Thornfield opened the front doors of Millbrook Elementary School. Parents had gathered in the schoolyard as they did every afternoon, chatting about the weather and weekend plans while waiting for their children to burst through the doors with stories of their day. But the doors opened to reveal empty hallways. Mrs. Chen arrived first, smoothing her floral dress as she looked around for Tommy. She spoke limited English but understood schedules perfectly. Her son was always prompt. Mrs. Mitchell stood nearby, clutching her purse and scanning the crowd for Sarah's auburn braids. The Hartwell family truck pulled up with a rumble, Billy's father stepping out with grease still under his fingernails from his job at the garage. "Where are the children?" Mrs. Chen asked Principal Thornfield in her careful English. Thornfield checked his pocket watch, his round face creasing with the first hints of concern. "Miss Hayes and her class should have returned by now. I'm sure they're just running a few minutes late. You know how children lose track of time in the woods." But 15 minutes passed, then 30. The crowd of parents grew restless. Some began walking toward the tree line at the edge of town, calling their children's names. The cheerful chatter died away, replaced by worried murmurs. At 4 o'clock, Thornfield made the decision to call the state police. 25 people don't just disappear," he told Sergeant William Murphy over the crackling phone line. "Miss Hayes is very responsible. Something must have happened." The first search party formed as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Fathers grabbed flashlights from their trucks while mothers stayed at the school, hoping the children would suddenly appear laughing about some grand adventure that had delayed their return. Tom Bradley, the town's postmaster, led a group of men along the Seneca Trail. They walked quickly at first, expecting to find Miss Hayes shepherding her students back toward town. But as they reached Miller's Creek, 2 miles into the forest, they discovered something that made everyone's blood run cold. Half-eaten sandwiches sat on flat rocks beside the stream. Sarah Mitchell's lunch bag lay open, her mother's neat handwriting still visible on the brown paper. Tommy Chen's thermos of soup had been abandoned mid-meal, still warm to the touch. A few steps away, someone had arranged small wildflowers in a perfect circle, the kind of nature art Miss Hayes often encouraged her students to create. They were here, Bradley called out to the other searchers. But where did they go? The men spread out, calling names that echoed uselessly through the darkening trees. They found footprints in the soft earth beside the creek, small shoe prints mixed with Miss Hayes's sensible teacher shoes. The tracks led away from the trail, deeper into the Pennsylvania wilderness where the forest grew thick and dangerous. As night fell completely over Millbrook, 24 sets of parents sat in the empty school gymnasium, staring at maps and drinking coffee that had grown cold hours ago. Outside, search teams with lanterns combed the woods, their voices growing hoarse from calling names that received no answer. The Millbrook 25 had vanished without a trace. By dawn, on May 13, 1954, Millbrook had transformed from a sleepy farming town into a command center buzzing with activity. State police cars lined Main Street, while uniformed officers set up communication equipment in the school gymnasium. The missing class had become front-page news across Pennsylvania, and reporters arrived with cameras and notebooks, eager to document the search for the Millbrook 25. FBI agent Catherine Walsh stepped out of a black sedan at 6 in the morning, her crisp suit and serious expression immediately commanding attention from the local authorities. At 35, she had handled missing persons cases across 3 states, but nothing quite like this. 25 people disappearing simultaneously defied every pattern she knew. "We need to expand the search grid," Walsh told Sergeant Murphy as they studied topographical maps spread across folding tables. If they left the trail at Miller's Creek, they could be anywhere within 50 square miles of wilderness. The National Guard arrived by helicopter at 8 o'clock, bringing trained search and rescue teams with specialized equipment. Governor Fine had personally authorized the deployment after receiving frantic calls from parents and local politicians. The missing children represented nearly every family in Millbrook, making this a community-wide tragedy. Search teams spread across the Pennsylvania forest like a carefully orchestrated army. Bloodhounds arrived from Pittsburgh, their handlers confident the dogs would pick up the scent trail within hours. The German shepherds sniffed the abandoned lunch bags at Miller's Creek and immediately began tracking north, their noses pressed close to the forest floor. But something strange happened 2 miles from the creek. Near the entrance to an old iron mine on Devil's Backbone Ridge, the dogs stopped. They circled the mine opening, whining and pawing at the ground, then sat down and refused to continue. Their handlers had never seen anything like it. "It's like the trail just ends here," said dog handler Frank Morrison, scratching his head as he stared at the dark mine entrance. "But mines are dangerous. No teacher would take children into abandoned shafts." Helicopters swept overhead in precise patterns, their crews scanning the endless green canopy for any sign of movement or clearing where people might have taken shelter. The thermal imaging equipment detected wildlife, deer and bears moving through their territory, but no human heat signatures anywhere in the search zone. On the 3rd day, a hiker found a child's brown leather shoe caught in brambles near Copper Falls, 3 miles southeast of the mine. Hope surged through the command center until Mrs. Patterson from the next town over identified it as belonging to her son, who had lost it during a family camping trip the previous summer. As the first week ended with no concrete leads, Agent Walsh addressed the exhausted parents gathered in the gymnasium. "We've covered every trail, every clearing, every abandoned building within 20 miles. We're expanding the search to include neighboring counties. Someone, somewhere, has seen your children." But privately, Walsh was beginning to suspect they weren't dealing with a simple case of people getting lost in the woods. The complete absence of physical evidence suggested something far more complex and potentially sinister than anyone wanted to admit. Agent Catherine Walsh spread missing person files across her temporary desk in the school's main office, each photograph showing a smiling child who should have been sitting in these very classrooms. 3 weeks into the investigation, the cheerful faces stared back at her from a growing wall of evidence that led nowhere. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Martha Cunningham, who ran the town's only diner, approached Walsh nervously on a Tuesday morning in early June. The elderly woman twisted her apron in her hands as she spoke. "There's something I should have mentioned earlier," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The day before those children disappeared, I saw a strange man hanging around the schoolyard. Looked like a drifter. You know, dirty clothes and wild hair. We called him Mad Pete Morrison." Walsh leaned forward, her pen ready. Can you describe him more specifically? Tall, maybe 50 years old, talked to himself a lot. He'd been camping in the woods near Devil's Backbone Ridge for about a week. Some of the men in town told him to move along, but he kept coming back. Said he was looking for work, but nobody would hire him. Within hours, Walsh had put out an alert for Peter Morrison across 3 states. The description matched a drifter who had been questioned in connection with missing children cases in Ohio and West Virginia, though nothing had ever been proven. Morrison had a history of mental illness and had been in and out of state institutions since the war. Meanwhile, the parents of Millbrook had organized their own search parties, no longer content to wait for official updates. Billy Hartwell's father, Jim, led a group of armed men who combed the forest with a determination that worried local authorities. These fathers knew every hunting trail and hidden clearing in the county, places the official search teams might have missed. If that crazy man hurt our children, Jim Hartwell told his companions as they checked abandoned cabins and old moonshine stills, the law won't have to worry about bringing him to trial. But it was Sarah Mitchell's mother who made the most disturbing discovery. While going through Miss Hayes' desk at the school, looking for any clue about the planned route, she found a folder marked personal, hidden in the bottom drawer. Inside were newspaper clippings about missing children from other states, dating back 2 years. Agent Walsh studied the clippings with growing alarm. Each case involved small groups of children who had disappeared during school outings or field trips. Some were eventually found safe, others remained missing. But the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had been collecting these stories, studying them. More troubling were the notes written in Miss Hayes' careful handwriting in the margins. Questions like, how long before they were missed? And, what mistakes did the searchers make? It looked like research, as if she had been planning something. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Parents who had trusted Miss Hayes completely now wondered if their beloved teacher had been involved in her students' disappearance. Had she led them into danger, or worse, had she planned their vanishing all along? The investigation had taken its darkest turn yet. The Stewart homestead sat like a forgotten wound on the landscape, 3 miles north of where the children had last been seen. Agent Walsh drove the rutted dirt road on a humid morning in late June, 1954, following up on a tip from the town's oldest resident, Mrs. Abernathy claimed she had seen Miss Hayes walking alone near the abandoned property just 3 weeks before the disappearance. The house itself was a skeleton of rotting wood and broken windows, surrounded by fields that had long since returned to wild grass and brambles. The Stewart family had packed up and moved to Pittsburgh in 1934, leaving behind 20 years of memories and a mortgage they could no longer afford during the Depression. Walsh parked her car and walked slowly around the property, noting how the tall grass had been disturbed in several places. Someone had been here recently, and more than once. Near the collapsed barn, she found fresh cigarette butts, the kind of expensive brand that teachers and government workers smoked, not the rough tobacco favored by local farmers. The real discovery came when she descended into the house's stone cellar. Her flashlight beam revealed disturbed earth in the northeast corner, an area roughly 8 feet by 12 feet where the packed dirt floor had been dug up and carefully smoothed over again. The work looked recent, probably within the last few months. Sheriff Murphy, she called from her car radio. I need a digging crew out at the old Stewart place. And bring the coroner. By afternoon, a crowd had gathered to watch the excavation. Parents stood in silent groups, their faces pale with dread as shovels bit into the suspicious earth. Each scoop of dirt could reveal the answers they desperately sought or confirm their worst nightmares. But after 6 hours of digging, the hole revealed nothing more sinister than broken pottery and old mason jars. Whatever had been buried here had been removed, leaving only disturbed soil and questions. Local historian Martha Cunningham provided the most intriguing information about the property. She met Walsh at the diner that evening, spreading out yellowed documents on the checkered tablecloth. The Stewart place sits on a whole network of limestone caves, Martha explained, pointing to a hand-drawn map from 1920. Natural caves and old mine shafts connected underground for miles. During Prohibition, bootleggers used them to hide liquor. Some say there are tunnels that run all the way to the river. More disturbing was what Martha revealed about recent activity on the property. About 2 months ago, a man came around asking questions about buying the land. Said he represented some company from Philadelphia, but he was more interested in the cave system than the farmland. Wanted to know about access points and whether the tunnels were still passable. The company turned out to be fictitious. The business address led to an empty office building, and the phone number was disconnected. Someone had been planning something involving the Stewart property, and they had gone to considerable trouble to hide their identity. As Walsh drove back to town in the gathering darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that the abandoned homestead held secrets that could explain everything. The disturbed earth, the mysterious buyer, and Miss Hayes's secret visits painted a picture of careful planning that made her stomach turn cold. 25 people don't simply vanish. Someone had made them disappear. The phone call that changed everything came on a sweltering July morning in 1954. Agent Walsh was reviewing cave maps in her temporary office when FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's assistant informed her that the Millbrook case had been escalated to a matter of national security. Within hours, federal agents descended on the small Pennsylvania town like an occupying army. They carried thick files marked classified and asked questions that had nothing to do with missing children. Instead, they wanted to know about Miss Eleanor Hayes's political beliefs, her college associations, and whether she had ever expressed sympathy for communist causes. The investigation took a sinister turn when agents discovered Eleanor's college records from Penn State. Between 1946 and 1950, she had attended several meetings of the Progressive Students Association, a group that advocated for workers' rights and racial equality. In Senator Joseph McCarthy's America, such associations were viewed with deep suspicion. David Hayes, Eleanor's younger brother who worked at the local bank, found himself dragged into the federal building in Harrisburg for 48 hours of intensive questioning. The agents wanted to know if his sister had ever spoken against the American government, if she had received mysterious letters or packages, and whether she had expressed unusual interest in current events involving the Soviet Union. Eleanor was the most patriotic person I knew, David protested during his interrogation. She made her students recite the Pledge of Allegiance every morning and taught them to respect the flag. The idea that she would betray her country is insane. But the federal investigators had found something that seemed to support their theory. Hidden in Eleanor's apartment was a collection of newspaper clippings about nuclear weapons testing and civil defense procedures. She had also purchased several books about survival techniques and wilderness living, materials that could be interpreted as preparation for life after a communist takeover. The town of Millbrook erupted in paranoia and fear. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, ran inflammatory headlines like, "Red Teacher Abducts American Children," and "Soviet Spies in Our Schools." Parents who had once praised Miss Hayes' dedication now whispered dark theories about her true intentions. Mrs. Chen, Tommy's mother, faced particular scrutiny because of her Chinese heritage. Federal agents questioned whether she had been in contact with Communist China and if her son had been specifically targeted for recruitment. The interrogation reduced the gentlewoman to tears, her limited English making it difficult to defend herself against accusations she couldn't fully understand. The Hayes family home became a target for vigilante justice. Windows were broken in the middle of the night, and someone painted "Commie Traitors" in red letters across the front door. Eleanor's elderly parents, who had lived in Millbrook for 30 years, were shunned at the grocery store and received anonymous death threats in their mailbox. The communist theory suggested that Miss Hayes had been recruited as a Soviet agent and had delivered 24 American children to enemy handlers who would spirit them behind the Iron Curtain. There, the children would be indoctrinated and eventually returned as sleeper agents to infiltrate American society. It was a theory that fed perfectly into the paranoid atmosphere of 1954 America, even though it had no basis in evidence or common sense. The first letter arrived on a crisp October morning in 1954, 6 months after the disappearance. Jim Hartwell was drinking his morning coffee when he noticed his name written in familiar block letters on the envelope. His hands shook as he recognized his son Billy's careful penmanship, the same writing that had covered homework assignments and birthday cards. "Martha," he called to his wife, his voice cracking. "You need to see this." The letter was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "Dear Dad, we are safe. Do not look for us. We will come home when we can. I miss you and Mom. Love, Billy." Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Within hours, FBI handwriting experts had descended on the Hartwell home, photographing the letter from every angle and comparing it to samples from Billy's school notebooks. The results were inconclusive. The writing looked like Billy's, but stress or fear could alter a child's handwriting significantly. More letters followed over the next few weeks. Sarah Mitchell's parents received a note describing how much she missed drawing flowers in their garden. Tommy Chen's mother got a letter in broken English that matched how Tommy usually translated for his parents. Each letter carried the same message. They were safe, but couldn't return yet. Agent Walsh traced the postmarks to Chicago, launching a massive search operation in the city's sprawling neighborhoods. Teams of agents showed photographs of Miss Hayes and the children to hotel clerks, restaurant workers, and train station employees. They found nothing. Chicago was too big, and if someone was hiding 25 people there, they had chosen their location well. The letters created a divide in the grieving community. Some parents clung to them as proof their children were alive, while others suspected an elaborate hoax designed to torture families who who had already suffered enough. The handwriting analysis remained frustratingly uncertain, neither confirming nor denying authenticity. Meanwhile, strange incidents continued to plague Millbrook. Mrs. Patterson, the new fourth-grade teacher, reported finding toys left on her classroom windowsill, a wooden horse that looked exactly like one that had belonged to Tommy Chen. The school custodian swore he heard children's laughter echoing from empty hallways after dark. Sarah Mitchell's father began camping in the woods near Devil's Backbone Ridge, convinced he had heard his daughter calling his name on moonless nights. Other parents dismissed his claims as grief-induced hallucinations, but several townspeople reported similar experiences. The voices always seemed to come from the direction of the old mine entrances, but searches revealed nothing. The most disturbing incident occurred in December, when several parents received Christmas cards featuring childish drawings of snow-covered trees and happy families. The artwork matched the style their children had used in Miss Hayes' class, complete with the same colored pencils and construction paper techniques she had taught them. Agent Walsh studied each piece of evidence with growing frustration. Someone was playing an elaborate psychological game with the grieving families, either giving them false hope that their children were alive, or providing genuine communication from wherever the missing class was being held. The question that haunted everyone was simple but impossible to answer. Who would be cruel enough to torture these families with hope, and why? By the spring of 1956, the FBI had officially scaled back the Millbrook investigation. Agent Catherine Walsh packed her files into cardboard boxes, her 2-year obsession with the case reduced to evidence that filled a government storage room. The stack of papers was 3 feet high. Thousands of interviews, forensic reports, and dead-end leads that had consumed her career and yielded nothing. Sometimes people just vanish, her supervisor told her during their final meeting in Harrisburg. 25 people can't disappear without a trace, but apparently they can. We've done everything possible. Walsh knew he was wrong, but she also knew when a case had been abandoned by bureaucrats more interested in statistics than justice. She left Millbrook on a gray Tuesday morning, driving past the memorial flowers that still appeared mysteriously on the school steps every few weeks. The town began its painful attempt to heal. A memorial service was held in the church that October, with 25 empty chairs arranged in rows where the missing should have Saturday. Parents wept over photographs and belongings that would never be reclaimed. The service was meant to provide closure, but it only emphasized how many questions remained unanswered. Some families couldn't bear the constant reminders. The Chens moved to Philadelphia, where Tommy's father found work in a restaurant and his mother could grieve without neighbors watching her every expression. The Mitchells relocated to her sister's farm in Ohio, taking nothing but clothes and Sarah's art supplies that would never be used again. Miss Hayes' elderly parents suffered the cruelest fate of all. The whispers and accusations about their daughter's possible involvement in the disappearance broke their spirits. Eleanor's mother died of a heart attack in December of 1956, and her father followed 3 months later. The doctor called it pneumonia, but everyone in Millbrook knew he had died of a broken heart and shame. Mrs. Gloria Patterson, the new fourth-grade teacher, faced the impossible task of replacing a ghost. She removed all traces of Miss Hayes from the classroom, painting over the nature drawings on the walls, and replacing the desk where Eleanor had planned lessons that were never taught. But the children who attended her class seemed distracted, as if they were listening for voices that would never answer. Strange incidents continued to plague the school. The custodian, old Mr. Brennan, reported finding chalk dust on the blackboard arranged in the shape of flowers, Sarah Mitchell's favorite subject. Books would be moved from their shelves overnight, always children's stories about adventure and exploration that Miss Hayes used to read aloud during story time. The most unsettling discovery came when Patterson cleaned out the supply closet in the spring of 1957. Hidden behind boxes of construction paper, she found a child's drawing dated May 10, 1954, just 2 days before the disappearance. It showed stick figures of children following a woman into a dark cave, with the words, "Going on adventure with Miss Hayes," written in crayon at the bottom. The drawing was signed with Tommy Chen's careful signature, but Tommy had been missing for 3 years. Who had left this picture in the closet, and why? Millbrook in 1962 looked like a town determined to erase its past. The old elementary school where Miss Hayes had taught was demolished on a crisp autumn morning, its red bricks hauled away to build a new post office in the next county. Principal Thornfield, now retired and haunted by memories, watched from his porch as bulldozers erased the building where 25 people had last been seen alive. The new elementary school rose on the opposite side of town, its modern architecture and bright yellow walls designed to create fresh memories untainted by tragedy. Parents who had lost children in the disappearance were invited to the ribbon-cutting ceremony, but most declined to attend. The past was too heavy to carry into hopeful new buildings. New families began moving to Millbrook as Pennsylvania's economy improved. Young couples from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia bought the affordable houses left empty when grieving families had fled. These newcomers often didn't learn about the 1954 disappearance until months after settling in, and many were shocked to discover their quiet town harbored such a dark mystery. Sarah Connor, a real estate agent who had moved from Scranton, experienced the town's conspiracy of silence firsthand. "I sold houses here for 3 years before anyone mentioned the missing children," she would later recall. "People acted like it never happened. When I finally heard the story, I understood why they wanted to forget. But forgetting proved impossible for those who remained." Tommy Chen's parents had moved to Philadelphia, but they returned to Millbrook every May 12th, the anniversary of the disappearance. Mrs. Chen would leave flowers at the site where the old school had stood, then visit Miller's Creek where they had found the abandoned lunches. She never spoke to anyone during these visits, but townspeople recognized her slight figure walking the same path her son had taken on his final day. The most heartbreaking incident occurred in 1966 when Billy Hartwell should have graduated high school. His parents, Jim and Martha, received a graduation card in their mailbox with no return address. Inside, someone had written, "Congratulations, Billy, class of 1966" in handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar. The postmark came from Denver, Colorado, over 1,000 miles away. FBI agents, who still monitored the case, investigated the card, but found nothing. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The paper was common drugstore stock, and hundreds of thousands of people passed through Denver's post office system. It could have been a cruel hoax or genuine communication from someone who knew Billy was supposed to graduate that year. Similar incidents plagued other families. Sarah Mitchell's mother swore she saw her daughter, now grown into a young woman, boarding a bus at the Pittsburgh station in 1968. She followed the woman for 3 blocks before losing her in the crowd, but the resemblance was so striking that Mrs. Mitchell suffered a nervous breakdown and required hospitalization. Local police stopped investigating these sightings after the first few proved false. "Grief plays tricks on the mind," Sheriff Murphy explained to families who reported seeing their missing children. "Sometimes people see what they need to see to keep hope alive." But hope, it seemed, was sometimes more painful than acceptance. Michael Torres was 23 years old when he first heard about the Millbrook 25, and the story consumed him like a fever. It was 1976, and Torres was working on his master's thesis in journalism at Penn State when his advisor suggested investigating cold cases from rural Pennsylvania. The missing class seemed like the perfect subject, a mystery with enough complexity to fill 200 pages. What Torres discovered during his research shocked him. The FBI files on the case had been heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out under claims of national security. For a story about missing children from a small farming town, the level of federal secrecy seemed extreme and suspicious. Torres spent 3 months in Millbrook during the summer of 1976, interviewing everyone who would speak to him. The town had grown to nearly 2,400 residents, and most of the newcomers had never heard the full story of what happened in 1954. But the old-timers remembered everything, and their memories were filled with details that had never appeared in official reports. Martha Cunningham, now 78, and still running the town diner, told Torres about the mysterious man who had asked about buying the Stewart property. He wasn't from any Philadelphia company, she insisted, stirring coffee with shaky hands. "That man talked like government, if you know what I mean. Had that way of asking questions without really asking them." Retired FBI agent Catherine Walsh, now living in Florida, agreed to meet Torres at a small cafe in Tampa. At 57, she remained sharp and bitter about how the investigation had been handled. The case had haunted her for 22 years, and she welcomed the chance to finally speak freely. "We were told to focus on the communist angle," Walsh admitted, lighting her 3rd cigarette of the interview. "But that never made sense. Eleanor Hayes was about as subversive as apple pie. Someone higher up wanted us looking in the wrong direction, and I never understood why." Walsh revealed something that had been kept out of all official reports. 3 days before the disappearance, she had received a phone call from someone claiming to be a federal agent, warning her to prepare for a national security situation involving missing persons. When she tried to verify the caller's identity, she was told the call had never been made. 25 people don't just vanish into thin air," Walsh told Torres, her eyes intense with old anger. "Someone made them disappear, and someone else made sure we never found out who or why. That's not incompetence. That's a cover-up." Torres published his findings in a controversial article titled "The Children the Government Forgot" in the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1977. The piece suggested that federal authorities had deliberately sabotaged the investigation to hide embarrassing connections between the missing teacher and classified government programs. The article was largely ignored by mainstream media, dismissed as another conspiracy theory in an era already saturated with suspicion about government secrecy. But Torres had planted seeds of doubt that would grow over the following decades, questions about why so much evidence remained classified and why a simple missing persons case had attracted such intense federal attention. The truth was still buried somewhere in those redacted files. The call came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in October of 1985. Construction worker Dale Morrison was operating a backhoe during highway expansion near Millbrook when his blade struck something that wasn't rock or root. He shut off the machine and climbed down to investigate, brushing mud away from what appeared to be old bones. Within hours, the construction site had transformed into an archaeological dig. State police cordoned off the area while forensic experts carefully excavated what appeared to be a child's skeleton, buried roughly 3 feet underground. The bones were small, consistent with someone around 10 or 11 years old, and appeared to have been in the ground for decades. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Parents who had never stopped grieving gathered at the construction site, some weeping with relief that they might finally have answers, others terrified of what those answers might reveal. Sarah Mitchell's mother, now 68 and frail, had to be supported by neighbors as she stared at the yellow crime scene tape. Dr. Patricia Williams, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, worked methodically to examine the remains. The bones showed no signs of trauma or violence, suggesting the child had not been murdered. More importantly, the skeleton was accompanied by artifacts that could help identify the victim: a small brass button from a school uniform and fragments of leather that might once have been shoes. But when the initial analysis was complete, Dr. Williams delivered crushing news to the assembled families. The brass button was manufactured in 1962, 8 years after the Millbrook disappearance. More conclusively, the bone development suggested the child had been closer to 15 years old at time of death, far too old to be one of Miss Hayes's fourth graders. The breakthrough that families had prayed for over 30 years proved to be another dead end. DNA testing, still a relatively new technology in 1985, eventually identified the remains as belonging to Michael Stevens, a runaway from Pittsburgh who had died of exposure during a harsh winter in 1964. The boy had been buried by local teenagers who found his body and were afraid they would be blamed for his death. The discovery brought unwanted media attention back to Millbrook. Television crews descended on the town, interviewing residents about the original disappearance and speculating about connections that didn't exist. The renewed spotlight forced many families to relive trauma they had spent decades trying to heal. Jim Hartwell, now 58 and gray-haired, stood at his son's empty bedroom window watching reporters set up cameras in the street below. "For 31 years I've hoped for news about Billy," he told his wife Martha. "But every time someone claims they found something, it just tears the wound open again." The false discovery had one lasting impact on the investigation. Advanced forensic techniques developed for examining the highway skeleton were later applied to evidence from the original case. Hair samples and fabric fibers that had been collected in 1954 were reanalyzed using methods that hadn't existed during the initial investigation. But even modern science couldn't conjure answers from evidence that had never pointed in any clear direction. The Millbrook 25 remained as mysteriously absent as ever. Detective Lisa Manning inherited the Millbrook 25 file on her first day with Pennsylvania's Cold Case Unit in January of 2000. The cardboard boxes filled half her office, decades of evidence that previous investigators had been unable to solve. At 34, Manning specialized in cases that had gone cold due to limited technology rather than lack of effort. Manning's first discovery came while digitizing old evidence reports. The original head count showed 24 children on Miss Hayes's class roster for the nature walk, but every witness statement and search report consistently mentioned 25 missing people. Someone had been added to the group after the official count, but the school records from 1954 were damaged in a fire at the county office building in 1967. Who was the 25th person? Manning asked herself, spreading attendance sheets across her desk. The math didn't work. 24 students plus Miss Hayes equaled 25 total, but every search document referred to the missing as the Millbrook 25, as if they were all separate individuals. Manning drove to Millbrook to interview Ruth Patterson, now 81, and the last surviving teacher from 1954. Ruth lived in a nursing home outside town, her memory sharp despite her age. She remembered the day of the disappearance clearly, including details that had never appeared in official reports. Eleanor was so excited about that nature walk, Ruth recalled, her weathered hands folding a tissue nervously. But there was something else. She mentioned taking along a special helper, someone who knew the trails better than she did. I never knew who she meant. The helper theory opened new possibilities. If Miss Hayes had recruited a local guide for the nature walk, that person might have been the 25th member of the group, but who would know the Seneca Trail well enough to serve as a guide? And why hadn't they been identified in the original investigation? Manning's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing property records for the Stewart homestead, she discovered that the mysterious Philadelphia company that had inquired about purchasing the land in 1954 was connected to a series of shell corporations that eventually traced back to the federal government. The Bureau of Land Management had been quietly acquiring properties throughout rural Pennsylvania during the 1950s, ostensibly for conservation purposes. But the Stewart property had no ecological significance that would justify federal interest. The land was valuable for one reason. It provided access to the extensive cave system that ran beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge. Ground-penetrating radar, technology unavailable in 1954, revealed the true scope of the underground network. The caves extended for miles in every direction, connecting to natural springs and eventually emerging near the Susquehanna River 15 miles away. Someone familiar with this system could theoretically travel great distances without ever appearing above ground. Manning requested the unredacted FBI files from 1954, but was told they remained classified for national security reasons. 46 years after the disappearance, federal authorities still considered the case too sensitive for full disclosure. The question that kept Manning awake at night was simple but troubling. What had 24 children and their teachers stumbled into that required a decades-long government cover-up? The Facebook group, Finding the Millbrook 25, was created on a humid Tuesday evening in June of 2010 by Sarah Chen Morrison, Tommy Chen's younger sister who had been born 3 years after the disappearance. Sarah had grown up hearing stories about the brother she never met, and social media offered new hope for solving a mystery that had consumed her family for 56 years. Within 6 months, the group had attracted over 50,000 members from around the world. Amateur detectives shared theories, posted enhanced photographs, and analyzed every scrap of evidence that had been made public. The group became a digital command center for people obsessed with unsolved mysteries, but it also attracted attention from individuals with questionable motives. The breakthrough that wasn't came on a snowy December morning in 2012. A woman calling herself Jennifer Matthews posted a childhood photograph in the group, claiming to be Sarah Mitchell, now 58 years old. The black and white image showed a girl with auburn braids standing beside a creek, and the resemblance to school photos of Sarah Mitchell was startling. "This is me at age 12, the post read. "I survived what happened in 1954, but I've been afraid to come forward until now. I'm ready to tell the truth about what Miss Hayes really did to us." The post exploded across social media, shared thousands of times within hours. News outlets picked up the story, and by evening, Jennifer Matthews was giving interviews to television reporters from her home in Oregon. She claimed that Miss Hayes had been part of an experimental government program and that the children had been taken to underground facilities for psychological testing. Detective Manning worked frantically to verify Matthews' claims, but something felt wrong from the beginning. The woman's story contained details that were publicly available online, but she couldn't answer basic questions about Millbrook that any resident would have known. When pressed about Sarah Mitchell's favorite color or her pet's name, Matthews became evasive and eventually stopped responding to calls. Digital forensics experts analyzed the photograph that had convinced so many people. Using advanced software unavailable to earlier investigators, they discovered that the image had been digitally manipulated. The face had been carefully grafted onto an old family photograph, created using technology sophisticated enough to fool casual observers, but detectable under professional analysis. The Jennifer Matthews hoax devastated the online community that had invested so much hope in solving the case. Angry members began attacking anyone who posted theories or claimed new information. The group became toxic, filled with arguments and accusations that drove away serious researchers. More disturbing was the response from people who believed they had identified living members of the Millbrook 25. Online vigilantes began harassing innocent individuals whose photographs bore resemblance to the missing children. A 60-year-old librarian in Michigan received death threats because someone thought she looked like an aged version of Emma Stewart, one of Miss Hayes' students. Detective Manning issued public warnings about the dangers of internet mob justice, but the damage was spreading beyond her control. The digital age had brought new tools for investigation, but it had also created new ways for obsession and paranoia to destroy innocent lives. The genealogy website notification appeared in Detective Manning's email on a quiet Thursday morning in March of 2014. A DNA match had been found for Eleanor Hayes, uploaded by someone researching their family tree. Manning had submitted Eleanor's DNA profile months earlier, hoping to identify any living relatives who might provide information about the missing teacher's state of mind before the disappearance. The match led to Margaret Hayes, Eleanor's older sister, who had never been mentioned in any of the original investigation files. According to public records, Margaret had died in Colorado in 1953, just 1 year before the Millbrook disappearance. Her death certificate listed the cause as a hiking accident in Rocky Mountain National Park, but her body had never been recovered. Manning drove to Denver to investigate Margaret's background, following a paper trail that had been overlooked for 60 years. What she discovered painted a picture of a woman whose beliefs were far more radical than her sister's alleged communist sympathies. Margaret Hayes had been involved with an environmental group called the Earth Preservation Society, founded in 1948 by Dr. James Whitmore, a former Manhattan Project scientist who had become convinced that humanity was destroying the planet. The group believed that modern civilization would collapse within a generation, and they established remote communities designed to preserve human knowledge and culture for future survivors. The Earth Preservation Society had purchased thousands of acres in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming during the early 1950s, creating self-sufficient settlements far from cities and government oversight. Members were encouraged to bring their children to these communities, where they would be educated in both traditional academics and survival skills necessary for life after the collapse of society. Manning's most significant discovery came at a Denver bank, where Margaret Hayes had maintained a safety deposit box for over 60 years. Bank records showed that the box had been opened regularly, with the last visit occurring in 1954, just weeks after the Millbrook disappearance. Inside the safety deposit box, Manning found letters between the Hayes sisters dating back to 1950. Margaret's correspondence revealed her growing conviction that nuclear war with the Soviet Union was inevitable, and that anyone who wanted to survive needed to abandon civilization immediately. Eleanor's letters showed initial skepticism about her sister's doomsday predictions, but her tone changed dramatically in early 1954. "You may be right about what's coming," Eleanor wrote in a letter dated March 15, 1954. "I see how frightened the children are when they practice those air raid drills. Maybe they would be safer away from all this madness." The final letter in the collection was from Eleanor to Margaret, dated May 10, 1954, just 2 days before the disappearance. The letter was brief but chilling. "I've made my decision. The children deserve a chance at a future, even if it's not the future their parents imagined for them. By the time you read this, we'll be beyond anyone's reach." Detective Manning stared at the letter, finally understanding what had happened to the Millbrook 25. This wasn't a kidnapping or a tragic accident. Eleanor Hayes had deliberately led her students away from what she believed was a doomed world, taking them to join her sister's survivalist community. The question now was simple: where were they? The Earth Preservation Society's property records led Detective Manning to a former member named Robert Whitfield, now 87 years old and living in a nursing home in Bozeman, Montana. Whitfield had been one of Dr. James Whitmore's closest associates, helping to establish 3 remote communes in the Rocky Mountain region during the early 1950s. Manning found Whitfield in the facility's garden, tending to tomato plants with shaking hands. When she mentioned Eleanor Hayes, his weathered face showed recognition that had been buried for decades. "I remember her," Whitfield said quietly, glancing around to make sure other residents weren't listening. "Margaret's sister. She came to visit the Montana settlement in the spring of 1954. Asked a lot of questions about how we educated the children, whether we had room for more families. The Montana commune had been the largest of the Earth Preservation Society's settlements, home to nearly 200 adults and children who had abandoned conventional society. They lived in underground shelters designed to protect against nuclear fallout, growing their own food and teaching skills necessary for survival after civilization collapsed. Whitfield revealed that Eleanor had spent 3 days at the commune, studying their educational methods and meeting with other teachers who had brought children to the remote community. She seemed particularly interested in how they handled children who missed their former lives and wanted to return to the outside world. "Some kids adapted quickly," Whitfield explained, his voice growing weaker. "Others cried for their parents every night. Eleanor asked what we did with the ones who couldn't adjust. Dr. Whitmore told her we never forced anyone to stay, but we also never let anyone leave who might reveal our location to authorities." The conversation took a dark turn when Manning asked about children arriving at the commune without their parents. Whitfield's eyes grew distant, and he was silent for several minutes before speaking again. "There were rumors," he admitted finally. "Stories about teachers and social workers who brought children they thought needed protection from the coming war. We called them rescued children. They lived with host families in the community and received new identities to prevent government interference." Manning pressed for more details about the spring of 1954. but Whitfield's memory became fragmented. He mentioned Eleanor leaving the Montana commune with supplies and detailed maps, but couldn't remember if she had taken anyone with her. He did recall Dr. Whitmore expressing concerns about Eleanor's mental state and her fixation on protecting children from nuclear destruction. The most disturbing revelation came when Manning showed Whitfield photographs of the missing Millbrook students. His face changed as he studied Tommy Chen's school picture, and he nodded slowly. "I've seen that boy before," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not at Montana, but there were other settlements, smaller ones that Dr. Whitmore established for special cases, children who needed extra protection." Before Manning could ask more questions, Whitfield suffered what appeared to be a minor stroke. As paramedics loaded him into an ambulance, he grabbed Manning's hand with surprising strength. "Eleanor brought us the future," he whispered, "the pure ones, but I never knew where she took them." The spring of 2014 brought the worst flooding Pennsylvania had seen in decades. 3 days of relentless rain had turned Devil's Backbone Ridge into a waterlogged mountain of unstable rock and saturated soil. Dr. James Patterson, a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, received an emergency call on March 15th to assess the damage and determine if the ridge posed a threat to the town below. Patterson had studied Pennsylvania's geology for 12 years, but he had never seen anything quite like the massive landslide that had torn a gash down the eastern face of Devil's Backbone Ridge. Tons of limestone and shale had collapsed, exposing rock formations that hadn't seen daylight for thousands of years. The slide had also revealed something that shouldn't have existed: clear evidence of human construction in a place where no one should have been able to build anything. "This is definitely not natural," Patterson radioed to his survey team as he studied the exposed cliff face through high-powered binoculars. Embedded in the rock wall, about 30 feet from the bottom of the slide, was what appeared to be a concrete structure with metal reinforcement bars. The construction looked old, probably dating from the 1940s or 50s, based on the materials and techniques. Patterson rappelled down the unstable rock face with extreme caution, his safety line secured to a tree that had somehow survived the landslide. As he got closer to the mysterious structure, he realized he was looking at a deliberately concealed entrance that had been sealed with explosives decades earlier. The blast pattern was unmistakable, and whoever had done this work had been professional. Behind the shattered concrete barrier, Patterson's flashlight revealed the mouth of a limestone cave that extended deep into the ridge. But this wasn't a natural cave formation. The walls had been reinforced with timber supports, and electrical cables ran along the ceiling, disappearing into darkness. Someone had spent considerable time and money converting this cave system into something much more sophisticated. "Control, I need immediate backup out here," Patterson called into his radio, "and contact the state police. I think I've found something connected to that old missing persons case from Millbrook." The cave entrance was wide enough for several people to pass through comfortably, and Patterson could see evidence that it had been used regularly. The floor was smooth from years of foot traffic, and metal brackets on the walls suggested that lighting systems had once illuminated the passage. Most intriguingly, the cave showed signs of recent habitation, empty containers, and modern debris that indicated someone had been using this space within the last few decades. Patterson secured the entrance and marked the coordinates on his GPS system. As he climbed back up the unstable slope, he couldn't stop thinking about the deliberate nature of the concealment. The entrance had been hidden so carefully that it would have been invisible before the landslide exposed it. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep this cave system secret, and Patterson suspected he had just discovered where the Millbrook 25 had vanished 60 years earlier. The landslide that had threatened the town below might have finally revealed the truth about one of Pennsylvania's greatest mysteries. Sheriff's Deputy Michael Torres rappelled into the cave system on March 18, 2014, as part of a 3-person search and rescue team equipped with modern lighting and safety gear. What he found at the bottom of the limestone cavern defied every expectation about the Millbrook 25 disappearance. The cave opened into a vast underground chamber that had been converted into a sophisticated living space. Solar panels, primitive by modern standards but advanced for the 1950s, were positioned near openings that led to the surface, providing electricity for a network of LED lights that still functioned after 60 years. A complex water filtration system drew from an underground spring, and storage containers lined the walls in neat rows. "This isn't a hiding place," Torres radioed to the surface team. "This is a home. Someone built a complete underground settlement down here." The living space was divided into distinct areas that clearly showed long-term habitation. 3 separate sleeping quarters contained metal beds with rotting mattresses, each area personalized with belongings that told individual stories. Books were stacked everywhere, classic literature mixed with science textbooks and survival manuals that had been carefully preserved in waterproof containers. Torres discovered Miss Hayes's teacher's desk positioned in what appeared to be a classroom area. The wooden surface was scarred from decades of use, and the drawers contained lesson plans written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. The dates on the plans showed continued education through December of 1954, proving that the missing class had survived in this underground refuge for at least 8 months after their disappearance. Children's schoolwork filled boxes near the desk, mathematics problems and essays that showed intellectual development continuing despite their isolation. Tommy Chen's precise handwriting covered pages of science notes about cave formations and underground water systems. Sarah Mitchell's artwork decorated the walls, drawings of flowers and animals created with colored pencils that had somehow been preserved in the dry cave environment. The most significant discovery was a metal filing cabinet that had been sealed against moisture. Inside, Torres found detailed records of daily life in the underground community. Miss Hayes had maintained meticulous documentation of food supplies, medical observations, and educational progress for each of her students. The records painted a picture of a teacher trying desperately to maintain normalcy in an impossible situation. But the cave held darker secrets as well. Medical supplies suggested that someone in the group had been seriously ill, and makeshift surgical tools indicated emergency procedures had been attempted. Food stores showed careful rationing, and the diminishing quantities suggested that supplies had been running dangerously low by the winter of 1954. Most puzzling was the complete absence of human remains. The living space showed clear evidence of abandonment, personal belongings left behind as if the inhabitants had departed quickly. Beds were unmade, meals were half-finished, and children's toys lay scattered across the floor. Whatever had caused the group to leave their underground refuge had happened suddenly. Torres found the final clue near the back of the cave system, where a tunnel led deeper into the mountain. Fresh air flowed through this passage, suggesting another entrance to the surface. The group hadn't died in their underground sanctuary. They had left it, venturing deeper into the cave system for reasons that remained mysteriously unclear. Detective Manning carefully opened the waterproof metal box that Deputy Torres had discovered wedged behind loose rocks near Miss Hayes's desk. Inside, protected by layers of oiled cloth, lay Eleanor Hayes's personal journal, its leather cover worn smooth by handling during the long months underground. The journal's first entry was dated May 14, 1954, just 2 days after the disappearance. Eleanor's handwriting, normally precise and controlled, showed signs of stress and uncertainty. "We are safe in the shelter that Margaret prepared for us. The children are frightened and confused, asking when they can go home. I don't know how to explain that home may not exist much longer. Margaret's warnings about the nuclear war seem more real every day. The newspaper headlines before we left spoke of increasing tensions with the Soviet Union." Manning turned the pages carefully, reading Eleanor's growing doubts about the decision she had made. The journal revealed that Margaret Hayes had spent years preparing the underground refuge, convinced that nuclear conflict was inevitable, and that only those who hid from civilization would survive the coming Holocaust. Eleanor's entries from June showed her attempts to maintain normal education routines while dealing with homesick children. Tommy Chen cried for his parents again today. "I told him they would be proud of how brave he's being, but I wonder if I will ever be able to reunite these children with their families. Margaret says the world above is becoming more dangerous every day, but I see no evidence of the war she predicted." By August, Eleanor's handwriting showed increasing desperation. "Billy Hartwell asked me directly when we're going home. I couldn't answer him. The radio broadcasts we receive speak of normal life continuing in the outside world. Schools are preparing for the fall semester. Families are planning vacations. Where is the nuclear catastrophe that Margaret promised would come by summer?" The journal's most heartbreaking entries came from the autumn months, as Eleanor realized the magnitude of her mistake. "I have stolen these children's lives based on my sister's paranoid fears. Sarah Mitchell should be starting 5th grade, not learning to maintain water filtration systems. Tommy Chen should be playing with friends, not memorizing survival techniques for an apocalypse that may never come." The final entries, written in December of 1954, revealed Eleanor's desperate plan to correct her terrible error. "I cannot let these children spend another winter underground while their families grieve. Tomorrow, we begin preparing for the journey home. I will face whatever punishment awaits me, but these innocent children deserve to see sunlight again." Her last complete entry was dated December 22, 1954. "We leave at dawn. I have written letters to each child's parents, explaining my actions and begging their forgiveness. The children are excited about going home for Christmas. They don't understand that I may be arrested the moment we reach Millbrook. I pray their families will forgive a teacher who thought she was protecting them from a war that never came." The journal's final page contained just one line, written in Eleanor's increasingly shaky handwriting. The back tunnel leads to freedom. God help us all. The rest was silence. The back tunnel that Eleanor Hayes had mentioned in her final journal entry led Deputy Torres and his team deeper into the mountain than anyone had expected. Following the path that the Millbrook 25 had taken on their journey home, the rescue team crawled through passages that grew narrower and more treacherous with each step. 300 yards from the main cave, Torres discovered evidence that the group had rested here during their escape. Children's mittens lay scattered on the rocky floor, and someone had carved "almost home" into the limestone wall in what appeared to be Tommy Chen's careful lettering. The words were followed by a date, December 23, 1954. The tunnel continued for another 200 yards before opening into a smaller chamber. Here, Torres made the discovery that would finally answer 60 years of questions. Massive limestone blocks had collapsed from the ceiling, completely sealing the passage that led toward the surface. The rockfall was enormous, tons of stone that had crushed everything beneath it. "We found them," Torres radioed to the surface team, his voice heavy with emotion. The geological evidence told the story that Eleanor's journal couldn't finish. A winter storm had saturated the limestone above the tunnel system, and the additional weight had caused a catastrophic collapse on December 23, 1954. The timing was cruel. The rockfall had occurred just as the group was approaching their freedom. Recovery teams worked for 3 days to carefully excavate the site. What they found beneath the rubble confirmed the tragic end of one of Pennsylvania's greatest mysteries. All 25 members of the group had died together, trapped in the tunnel as they tried to return home for Christmas. Miss Eleanor Hayes was discovered with her arms protectively around 2 of her smallest students, Tommy Chen and Sarah Mitchell. Even in their final moments, she had tried to shield them from the falling rocks. The other children were found clustered together, their teacher's influence evident in how they had tried to help each other during the disaster. Personal items recovered from the site painted a picture of people who had been looking forward to reuniting with their families. Billy Hartwell clutched a hand-carved wooden toy he had made as a Christmas present for his father. Sarah Mitchell's backpack contained drawings she had created to show her parents what she had learned during their time underground. Most heartbreaking were the letters that Eleanor Hayes had written to each child's parents, carefully sealed in waterproof envelopes and carried with her during the escape attempt. The letters revealed her deep remorse for the decision she had made and her desperate hope that the families would understand she had acted out of misguided love, not malice. "I thought I was saving them from a nuclear war that never came," Eleanor had written to Tommy Chen's parents. "Instead, I stole 8 months of his childhood and your time with your precious son. I pray that someday you can forgive a teacher who loved her students enough to make the worst decision of her life." The Millbrook 25 had died together while trying to return to the families who had never stopped searching for them. The memorial service held on May 12, 2014, exactly 60 years after the disappearance, was the largest gathering in Millbrook's history. Over 3,000 people filled the town square, including families who had moved away decades earlier and returned to finally say goodbye to children they had never stopped mourning. DNA testing had confirmed the identities of all 25 victims, providing closure that 3 generations of families had desperately needed. Tommy Chen's younger sister, Sarah, now 63 years old, wept as she held a photograph of the brother she had never met. Billy Hartwell's nephews, men in their 40s who had grown up hearing stories about their vanished uncle, stood together in quiet solidarity with other families who had carried this burden for 6 decades. The wooden toy that Billy had carved for his father was displayed alongside other personal items recovered from the tunnel collapse. His father had died in 1987, never knowing that his son had thought of him during those final moments underground. But Billy's mother, Martha, now 91, and in a wheelchair, touched the small wooden horse with trembling fingers. "He was making this for Christmas," she whispered to her granddaughter. "Even at the end, he was thinking about coming home to us." Detective Manning stood before the assembled crowd to explain what the investigation had revealed about Miss Hayes' tragic decision. The teacher, who had been suspected of everything from communist conspiracy to child abduction, had actually been a victim of Cold War paranoia and family manipulation that convinced her nuclear destruction was imminent. Eleanor Hayes was not a criminal, Manning told the hushed audience. She was a teacher who loved her students so much that she made a terrible mistake trying to protect them from a war that existed only in her sister's frightened imagination. She died trying to bring them home. The letters Eleanor had written to each family were read aloud by volunteers, their words providing insights into 8 months of underground life that had been both educational adventure and homesick torment for the children. Sarah Mitchell's parents, both deceased, had their letter read by their surviving daughter, who learned that her sister had continued creating art even in the depths of the cave system. The town of Millbrook dedicated its new elementary school to the memory of the Millbrook 25, installing a memorial garden where children could learn about the importance of critical thinking and questioning authority, even when that authority claimed to act out of love. The garden featured 25 oak trees, one for each victim, surrounding a plaque that read, "In memory of those who were lost, while someone tried to save them from imaginary dangers." The discovery had also revealed the extensive network of 1950s survivalist communities that had operated in secret across rural America. Several other cases of missing families and children were reopened as investigators realized that Cold War fears had motivated more disappearances than anyone had previously understood. For the first time in 60 years, Millbrook could finally heal. The mystery that had haunted 3 generations was solved, and 25 graves in the town cemetery were no longer empty. The Millbrook 25 could finally rest in peace.